Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and what's next. It's a show that asks questions and peels back the layers of our average everyday experience and goes beyond scratching the surface. We interview people doing incredible things who are making a difference around the globe. Join me as we listen in and get one step closer to understanding that big ideas shared create collaboration. Collaboration can inspire community, and communities create social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. So my next interview is with actor, director, producer, writer Paul Gross. He's quite the Canadian icon, really. I mean, I remember Elizabeth and I, and we'll talk about this briefly, my wife saw him before we were married at an event at Stratford. He was fantastic. He played Hamlet. He's going to talk a little bit about it in the interview and talk about some of the issues surrounding it. One of the connecting points between that and our interview is the notion of trust. He's talking about his new film, Hyena Road, which is about the Canadian military involvement in Afghanistan. And it was a great conversation. We talked about listening, we talked about cross-cultural awareness, we talked about, the whole notion of modern warfare being incredibly complex, and what does it actually mean for, us as individuals, us as a country, politically, and so on. The conversation could have gone on for hours, as I think we both said. You're going to really enjoy it. Paul's a great guy. He's got a lot of insight, clearly a passionate, intentional, very committed filmmaker who clearly wants to make a difference. So hope you go out to see the film, Hyena Road. Listen in to Paul and what he has to say about pre-Hamlet and post-Hamlet and a whole lot of other things. You're going to love this interview. Thanks. And don't forget to check out more information on davidpecklive.com. Coming soon to a theater near you. Well, welcome to Face to Face. We are joined by a very special guest today here on this cold, kind of clammy Monday morning out here in Oakville, and I'm not sure where Paul's coming from, but Paul Gross, writer-director of Hyena Road, is joining us today. Paul, thanks for taking the time.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
So we don't have a lot of time, so we've got to get right to it. I'd love to talk about, I'd like to waste a few minutes on some idle chit-chat, Paul, but we don't have any.
Let's just get serious.
Let's get serious. You've said that Hyena Road is not a war movie, and I find that pretty interesting because coming out of the TIFF screening, world premiere, by the way, right, at TIFF?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. Coming out of the screening, how is that not a war movie? And yet I think I know what you're getting at.
I'm not even sure I did say that, but if I did, okay. I'll defend it.
Good, nice. I like that. Nice way to save that.
Obviously, it's a movie that concerns people in war.
Yeah.
But I think I actually should go back a bit. I first went to Afghanistan in 2010.
Okay.
And I'm not entirely sure what I expected when I went, but what I did encounter when I was there is quite unlike anything I was prepared for, either by what governments had told us or what the media had told us for the most part. And so I thought I would return with and at least photograph it. I wasn't sure that there was a film that I wanted to make necessarily, but at least commit it to film. So I went back a few months later with the camera team, and we spent a couple of weeks way outside the wire at a forward base just kind of photographing anything we could point cameras at.
Right.
And it was during that trip, talking to soldiers of various disciplines and meeting the Afghans that worked with us and going out on foot patrols and so forth, that I started to see that there was something in there. And in a sense, the film itself is just a series of incidents that were told to me by soldiers and characters that people I met, and I kind of assembled it into a narrative order. But what really struck me was the complexity of it. And I guess what I suppose I was trying to say is, I said it's not a war film. It's not a war film in the conventional sense. Here's a bunch of bad people,
right,
and we can identify them because they're wearing their uniforms, and they are Nazis, and we have to kill them.
Right.
The modern warfare is hugely different and an extraordinarily complex environment that doesn't seem to have doesn't seem to have any fixed moral compass, and the agendas are colliding not only within the country itself, but also within the military. They don't always sync up. So the military refers to it as there are the two sides of the war. There's the kinetic war, which is shooting war, and then the non-kinetic war, which is, I guess, what we call hearts and minds.
Right.
Which is much less about opening up schools and irrigation projects, although that's part of it. But it's an awful lot of what they do is try to maneuver power brokers in a region.
There's a great scene, Paul, where you and Brian and a few others, I think, are in the middle of quite a battle, and it's really intense, music, etc., filmmaking, and so on. And you watch the Afghanis in the town just kind of going about their business.
Yeah,
and you go, hang on a minute. Talk about complexity, right?
Yeah. And I was really struck by that. That when I went, the first time I was on a foot patrol, the battle group was the Vendus, the regiment out of Quebec, and the man who was the soldier, I guess he was probably a lieutenant, I'm not really sure. Anyway, he was from Rimouski and had this extraordinarily thick accent. And, so much so that I found it hard to understand him sometimes. And we sat down for a shura, a meeting, and there were the 3 or 4 Afghan elders, the Afghan National Army commander, the Canadian soldier, and his translator. And at one point, it's like Tower of Babel, everyone's talking at once, and at one point the lieutenant asks something, and his translator translates, and I know for a fact, I couldn't understand him. I know absolutely there was no way that the translator understood. And I thought, this is wild. It's not only are we asking young men and women to be reasonably good leaders of a small number of soldiers, but we're also asking them to be the leading edge of our foreign policy. And that's where I started to think that there's something that we need to know about this. Because like most Canadians, I'll just talk for myself, I was really ignorant as to what it was our military was doing.
Right.
And what it was we expected of them, and really ignorant as to the burden that they have to shoulder.
Well, there's a tendency to really polarize, right? Right, wrong, good, bad, up, down. It's we shouldn't be there, we should be there, right?
Yeah, and I don't even have an opinion about whether we should or should not have been there. I think it's difficult. You kind of have to ask, well, at what point?
Right.
Because the mission was unbelievably long. I mean, we were there longer than the First World War, Second World War, and Korean War combined.
Yeah, that's an astounding fact. It's crazy.
Yeah. And it evolved, a lot, or changed a lot from our first arrival there to when we finally left.
I love the fact that you went. The fact that you went in country to get sort of a cross-cultural experience, shot a lot of this B-roll. Not even sure you had a story. I love that. I'm not sure, Paul, if that's ego or just genius, but probably a bit of both, right?
Foolish,
yeah. But what I love is that, and I think you've just validated this. I read it somewhere, but that you drew a story out of the people you met, the hands that you shook, the eyes that you made contact with. The faces that you connected. I think that's brilliant. I think that's really wise storytelling.
Well, I certainly wasn't very conscious of that. I wish I could say I knew I would go there and find the material for a story, but I don't. It was sort of, I just felt compelled to go, I guess.
Right. Yeah, it's good. It's good.
And to try to have some understanding of what it was we're doing, in particular because I think we're going to be engaged in another such conflict. The world does not seem to be settling down, and obviously there's a fair bit of discussion about northern Syria, Iraq, ISIS, and all of that. And I think this is not to say that I have an opinion particularly about whether we should or should not be engaged in these conflicts, but I think we should at least understand what they are and what it is we are asking our friends and our neighbors and our relatives to do.
I was at a meeting many years ago, and I'm sure I've mentioned this a past podcasts, with a former U.S. ambassador to Cambodia. I was in Phnom Penh, do a lot of work over there, and he said to me, Cambodia's problems are nothing that a couple of 100 funerals won't solve. And it's a horrible, dark thought. But when I saw the tagline for the film, or at least one of them, "One bullet can change everything," is that kind of what you're talking about?
I think so. I had an amazing meeting when I was first in Afghanistan with this American guy who had headed up the provincial reconstruction team in Kandahar City.
Right.
And I said, we were having a coffee at one of the forward bases, and I said, can you take some time with me just to try to explain this place? And he said, well, it's sort of instructive to think of it like feudal England, sort of pre-Crusades, that there is a king whose power goes up and down depending on his relationships. There are a series of very powerful dukes who have armies, and they fight against one another. And what we're trying to do and making headway with is that the dukes come to an understanding amongst themselves that it's in their interest to have a coherent country against outside predation. And obviously, Afghanistan is in a terrible neighborhood, and there's a lot of interference from obviously formerly the Soviet Union, but also a great deal of interference from Pakistan. And it is actually kind of like that, because when you're in the rural environment, it is kind of like looking back 5,000 years. And the opaque nature of this culture, the Pashtun culture in particular, is really hard for us to understand. I sat across from this man who's known as the Ghost, Haji Malik, and it is a real guy.
Talk about a great face. I mean, the eyes, the face, what he's communicating and not communicating. Brilliant.
Yeah. And I thought, I could spend the rest of my waking hours with this guy. I'll never understand him.
Yeah.
And I think that's also a big part of what's happening, is we try to work in partnership with Afghans whose objectives, coincide with ours. And yet we're also working with people that are extremely difficult for us to understand. And a lot of that is carried on the shoulders of very young men and women.
Right.
Right. So I think the whole thing of it just sort of throws war upside down. I've been using this phrase postmodern warfare, but it does actually seem to be applicable, because it doesn't bear much relationship to any war that we've been involved in before.
Do you want me to walk out of the theater going, "Wow, that was a great movie," or "Wow, that was a great"?
First and foremost,
okay.
It is a movie. It's not a lecture. But I also want you to walk out, I hope, with a tactile sense of the complex nature of what it is we're asking our fellow citizens to do, and so that we're more informed when the next time rolls around. And we may decide collectively we don't think it's a great idea. We may decide yes it is, but at least we're informed.
Yeah. I think it's the kind of sort of you could almost look at it as an academic piece in a sense, because it's the kind of film that could be studied by film students, by sociologists or international development students, just talking about things like cross culture. What a brilliant comment. I could spend the rest of my life with this guy and not understand him. And I think if we started there, Paul, on so many of these conversations, warfare, foreign policy, aid, development, wouldn't it change the conversation a little bit?
Well, I would hope it would. The more information we have, the better at whatever it is we're trying to do we might become. I felt, and I have also talked with lots of generals and become quite, I know soldiers up and down the chain of command.
Sure.
Who are involved in Afghanistan, and all of them talk about the ferociously complex nature of how difficult it is to achieve things, the objectives that may, whatever's on the table at the time. And I don't think we, as a population, had any idea about that.
Right.
We were, of course, any government is going to soft pedal what it is they're asking the military to do. That's just historically what they do. But I think that the press was not particularly helpful. We had some good, correspondence there, but by and large, people would sort of parachute into the country, spend about a week and a half, and file reports that might have been pulled off of the wire service and could have been done in, oh my God, it was a huge siren. It could have been pulled off, done in Mississauga.
Right.
And I think we were poorly served as a population in terms of the information about what was happening. And I think, the knock-on effects of this are, obviously, we're becoming quite aware, generally speaking, I think, about the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder and operational stress disorder. And this is an ongoing problem, and not one that won't also be in attendance in the next conflict we enter. More soldiers have killed themselves and were killed in combat. And I think we also have to have a look at that. What are we expecting of people, and can they shoulder this burden?
So, Believe it or not, we're going to have to wrap up here in a couple of minutes, and I hope maybe.
I know it's a topic you could talk about.
Oh,
isn't it?
we could go for hours. I mean, I want to invite you in to come and lecture at my international development class at Humber in January. Seriously, we could talk.
I'll come. Not that I'm not very good at lectures, but I can answer questions.
Well, you know what? That's kind of how I approach teaching. It's more of a conversation. It's a dialogue, and I think that's what participatory, development's all about. And I think that's what a great filmmaker's really all about. Having a conversation with their audience. You clearly take this stuff very seriously. I think any writer director has to, but you've got the connection of writer director actor, been around it forever. Do you feel kind of maybe this might have to be the last question, but do you feel kind of a moral responsibility as a filmmaker, Paul, that here you're taking on such an important subject. You're representing Canadians, you're representing the military, Afghanis, etc. Where do you sit with some of that? That's a lot to bear.
Yeah, I guess it is when you put it like that. I didn't.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh my God, I'm exhausted, Sonny.
That's right.
I don't think I was thinking that so clearly when I was there. What
Sure.
I did feel, though, is that our men and women in the Canadian Forces really do represent us with an extraordinary amount of integrity and honor. It's something that we should all take great pride in. And I felt that if I was going to do a story that concerned their engagement, that I would try as best I could as to be authentic and accurate. And I guess because that was the prime directive of everybody involved in the film, it forced us to contend with it realistically,
right.
As opposed to bending stuff to suit some kind of cinematic end. There are some licenses taken, obviously, because it is a film.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But I think we were always trying to make sure that whatever we were doing was true to and accurate to what the conflict was. And then that makes you, I just think that makes you have to shoulder all of those other things that you just described.
Yeah, and I think that is utterly important to any kind of storytelling, I suppose. But for me, and it's sorry to maybe overanalyze it, but I think down the road, it's what the truths that the film are going to point to. People will be able to look back and go, wow, we don't really understand this culture. What the hell are we doing there? Or what are we doing there in this way? Maybe we need to tweak something. And I think that's the brilliance of this kind of seems to me of this kind of art. Hey, can I tell a great story about you and my wife and I meeting you in 15 years ago, and you don't remember?
Sure.
So we saw you, and we've chatted about this before, but we saw you at Stratford. What a brilliant performance. And I leaned over to my wife. We were dating at the time. Before we were married, Elizabeth and I were there in the theater, and I said, watch, you wait for it, standing ovation. And sure enough, you got this brilliant standing ovation. There you are, performing Hamlet, etc., hundreds of times, I suppose, over the season. You told me earlier that there was this thing about trust there for you. Can you just wrap up this conversation? Because I think that's kind of what we're talking about here, Paul. Military, cross-cultural development, et cetera, et cetera. It was a really interesting insight.
Well, I think that, Hamlet, there's my good friend and Joe Ziegler, who directed me in Hamlet. He said, this is going to change your life.
Right.
And you will not be in control of it. It will run away with you, and you just have to kind of give in to it. And when he was telling me this, I had no idea what he was talking about. He sounds hysterical. And of course,
right.
And of course it did. I mean, Hamlet is one of those creations artistically that maybe there are 10 that would be as significant. It's not a play that has any center. It's sort of bottomless. And at a certain point, doing Hamlet is a bit like you just have to close your eyes and fall off the 10-meter diving board.
Right.
And you don't, and you have to trust that Shakespeare knows what he's doing with you, and that at some point he'll let you back out again. And that's very much what that experience was like for almost a year and a half, where I kind of went crazy for a while. And it has broken the backs of other actors. Daniel Day-Lewis being a great example, who just could not finish one performance and walked off the stage and went back to the play.
That's a crazy story.
Yeah, and it is an encounter. It sort of reminded, this is going to sound a bit odd, but it reminded me a bit of a trip that my family took into the Sahara. We were there for a couple of weeks, and I remember reading a quote from Paul Bowles where he said, "It is an encounter with the absolute. And once you have encountered that, you must return." And I felt that a little way about, looking back in retrospect on what Hamlet was like. It's like an encounter with
Well, I bet
deepest mysteries. And it rattles you to the bone.
It's a beautiful phrase, encounter with absolutes. I mean, you must have felt every film must feel like that to some degree, but also just having that opportunity, to go into Afghanistan to tell a story like this. It's got to be kind of similar in some respects.
It is a little bit, I think. You drop deep inside some world and let it take you wherever it wants to go, as opposed to you trying to make it conform to something to a predetermined idea. And it changed, I think, the experience with working on Hyena Road is probably going to change me quite a bit as a writer. Because I didn't feel so much that I was writing it as it was writing itself. And there's a liberty in that, if you trust it, that is, I suppose, what most artists strive for. And I've only just encountered it, so I think I'm going to try and do it again.
Try and duplicate it. Well, listen, you did a marvelous job, and I thank you so much, and I hope we can do a part 2 down the road. Paul Gross joining us today, writer, director, producer of Hyena Road. Really appreciate the time you spent with us today.
That was a great talk. Thanks very much for having me on.